The air over the Mediterranean Sea was warm and thick on the night of July 11, 1943. Inside the vibrating aluminium fuselage of a C-47 Skytrain, the world had been reduced to the drone of two Pratt & Whitney engines and the smell of sweat, canvas, and aviation fuel. The men of Colonel Reuben Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division, were packed shoulder to shoulder on bucket seats, their faces grim in the dim red glow of the cabin lights. This was the second wave of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The first wave, 2 nights prior, had been a chaotic, wind-scattered mess. This one was meant to be different, a powerful reinforcement punch to solidify their precarious foothold. As their armada of 144 unarmed transports approached the coast, the sky erupted, not with the expected German or Italian flak, but with a terrifyingly familiar pattern. Traces of .50 caliber and shells from 20mm and 40mm guns stitched across the night, fired from the very Allied naval vessels they were sent to support. The pilots, flying in tight V formations as ordered, had no room to maneuver. A crewman on a nearby ship later recalled the sickening realization: we were shooting down our own planes. Inside the transports, the paratroopers, men who had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the army, could only watch in helpless horror as the fuselages around them were shredded. Green lights flashed on inside crippled aircraft, a signal for an emergency jump into the sea. Other planes blossomed into orange fireballs, cartwheeling into the dark water below, taking every man with them. In those few horrific minutes, 23 C-47s were blown from the sky. Another 37 were grievously damaged, limping back to their North African bases riddled with holes. Over 300 paratroopers and aircrew were killed, wounded, or missing, many without ever hearing a shot fired by the enemy. The American airborne concept, an audacious experiment born of German successes, was burning on the beaches and sinking in the waters of Sicily. The German commanders sifting through reports of widely dispersed, disorganized paratroopers, the conclusion was simple. The American airborne was a tactical failure, a poorly executed gimmick. Back at Allied headquarters, the sentiment was dangerously similar. The grand theory of vertical envelopment had collided with the brutal friction of war, and it seemed to have shattered on impact. The laughter of the skeptics, both Allied and Axis, was almost audible above the wreckage. The idea had been so compelling in theory, so clean on a map. It was born from the shock of German Fallschirmjäger seizing the Belgian fort of Ebenemehl in 1940, and more significantly, their costly but successful airborne invasion of Crete in 1941. American military planners, watching from afar, saw the future, an army that could leap over front lines, seize critical junctions, and sow chaos in the enemy's rear. In a flurry of activity, the U.S. Army Airborne Command was established, and the main training ground was laid out in the humid pine forests of Fort Benning, Georgia. Here, the doctrine was written from scratch. Volunteers, culled from the toughest and fittest infantrymen, were put through a grueling physical and psychological regimen. They ran endless miles in the Georgia heat, mastered the intricacies of the T-5 parachute, and learned to pack hundreds of pounds of equipment into specialized containers. The culmination of their training was 5 qualifying jumps from a C-47, the final one a tactical jump at night. The silver wings pinned on their chests after that 5th jump were more than insignia. They were a symbol of entry into a new warrior caste. In August 1942, this new force took shape with the activation of the first 2 airborne divisions. The 82nd, a reconstituted infantry division from World War I, and the 101st, a new unit whose emblem was a screaming eagle. The 82nd, under the command of the disciplined and demanding Major General Matthew Ridgway, and its ambitious assistant division commander, Brigadier General James M. Gavin, was slated for the European theater first. The 101st, led by Major General William C. Lee, would follow. They were equipped with the best the Army could provide: the M1 Garand rifle, the new M1 carbine, Thompson submachine guns, and the innovative bazooka, but their true weapon was meant to be surprise. The plan was simple. A fleet of transport planes would drop thousands of men with their light equipment, who would then assemble rapidly on the ground, seize their objectives, and hold until relieved by conventional ground forces. It required precise navigation, perfect timing, and a degree of battlefield coordination that was, in 1943, entirely untested by American arms. The logistical chain was immense. Each man jumped with 70 to 90 pounds of gear strapped to his body. Rifles were carried in padded cases, machine guns and mortars were broken down and dropped in separate containers. It all had to be found, assembled, and put into action in the dark, on unfamiliar terrain, while under enemy fire. The theory was sound. The men were willing. But the gap between the training fields of Fort Benning and the hostile skies of Europe was about to be measured in blood. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Operation Husky, was the airborne's baptism of fire. The plan called for the 82nd Airborne Division to drop inland to seize key road junctions and high ground behind the Jella beaches, where the U.S. 1st Infantry Division was scheduled to land. Specifically, Colonel James Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, augmented with a battalion from the 504th, would lead the assault. On the night of July 9th, 226 C-47s lifted off from airfields in Tunisia, crossing 350 miles of open water. The mission began to unravel almost immediately. Navigators, inexperienced in long-range formation flights over water, struggled to stay on course. Worse, they flew into an unforecasted gale with winds gusting up to 35 miles per hour. The tight formations, essential for a concentrated drop, broke apart. Pilots, many making their first-ever combat flight, became disoriented. The result was one of an airborne commander's worst nightmares, a scattered drop. Instead of landing together on their designated drop zones near Jella, the paratroopers were strewn over 1,000 square miles of southeastern Sicily. Some men landed in their target area, but many did not. One group of paratroopers landed more than 60 miles away from their objective. Colonel Gavin himself landed nearly 25 miles from his target, finding himself utterly alone in the darkness. He began walking, slowly gathering a small band of troopers from various units. For hours, his command consisted of a handful of officers and enlisted men, a microcosm of the division's predicament. Small pockets of determined paratroopers, often led by junior officers or sergeants, fought isolated, desperate battles wherever they landed. They ambushed German patrols, cut communication lines, and created an illusion of a much larger force. A German officer, captured days later, admitted his unit's paralysis, stating, "Reports of American paratroopers were received from all over Sicily." This unintentional chaos was the only silver lining. The men of the 82nd failed to seize their primary objectives as a coherent force, but their widespread presence deeply confused the German and Italian defenders, delaying their counterattacks against the main amphibious landings. The first turning point for the American airborne was not a victory, but a catastrophe that threatened its very existence. The chaotic drop of the 505th on July 9th was a harsh lesson in the realities of weather and navigation. The friendly fire incident that savaged the 504th 2 nights later was a lesson in the critical need for inter-service coordination. General Ridgway, a man not given to hyperbole, was livid. He saw his elite division, forged through months of brutal training, crippled not by the Wehrmacht, but by his own navy. The final casualty count for the Sicily airborne operation was stark. Of the 5,300 paratroopers who jumped, nearly 10% became casualties, with 201 killed, 1,232 wounded or injured, and 856 missing or captured. More telling was the equipment loss. The division recovered less than half of its supply bundles, and only a fraction of its artillery and anti-tank guns. In the aftermath, a blame game erupted. The Navy blamed the Army Air Forces for poor navigation and for not sticking to the designated safe air corridors. The Air Forces blamed the Navy for trigger-happy gunners. The paratroopers just knew their comrades were dead. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was so disturbed by the performance and the losses that he seriously considered scrapping all future large-scale airborne operations. He commissioned a report, and its findings were damning. It cited inexperienced pilots, inadequate navigation equipment, and a complete breakdown in communication between air, land, and sea forces. To the Germans, who had found isolated, under-equipped American paratroopers all over the island, the operation confirmed their belief that the Americans had tried to copy the German model without understanding its complexity. A German intelligence report summarized the American effort as a fiasco, tactically ineffective and extravagantly wasteful of elite troops. For a moment, it seemed the great American airborne experiment was over. The human cost of the Sicily disaster resonated most deeply with the men in the planes. For them, it was not a matter of strategy or statistics, but of visceral terror. One paratrooper from the 504th later described the flight into the wall of friendly fire. He spoke of the utter helplessness of being a passenger in a slow-moving, unarmored aircraft being systematically dismantled by Allied guns. The sound of shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminium skin, the screams of wounded men, the sight of a neighboring plane's wing shearing off in a burst of flame, these were the images seared into their minds. "We expected to fight Germans," one survivor recalled, "not the U.S. Navy." This sense of betrayal, of being needlessly sacrificed, was a deep wound. The confidence that had been built so carefully at Fort Benning was shaken to its core. The brass wings on their chests felt heavier. They had jumped into Sicily as an elite, confident force. Those who survived came out of it as hardened, cynical veterans who now understood that the greatest threat could come from any direction, including from behind. This harsh education, however, would become the foundation for a critical adaptation. The survivors now knew what failure looked like, what it felt like. They would not let it happen again. Just as the airborne concept was being questioned at the highest levels of command, a crisis on another Italian beachhead offered a chance for redemption. In September 1943, General Mark Clark's U.S. Fifth Army landed at Salerno in Operation Avalanche. They met ferocious German resistance and were in danger of being driven back into the sea. The beachhead was crumbling. In a moment of desperation, Clark sent an urgent message to General Eisenhower. Could the 82nd Airborne, now recuperating in Sicily, be dropped directly onto the beachhead as emergency reinforcements? It was a high-risk gamble. The drop zone was a small, postage stamp-sized strip of land, barely 1,200 yards long, surrounded by enemy positions. A repeat of the Sicily scatter would be fatal. Matthew Ridgway, however, saw it as a chance to prove his division's worth. He accepted the mission without hesitation. Working with the Troop Carrier Command, Ridgway's staff planned the operation in less than 12 hours. This time, there would be no mistakes. The flight path was meticulously plotted. Pathfinders, specialized troops who jumped first to mark the drop zone, would use ground markers, in this case, sand-filled oil drums set ablaze to form a giant T to guide the main force. On the night of September 13th, 60 C-47s carrying men of the 504th Pier took off. As they approached the Salerno coast, the pilots saw the flaming T and aimed for it. The drop was a model of precision. Within an hour, nearly 1,300 paratroopers had landed accurately on the drop zone, assembled quickly, and moved to plug the most critical gaps in the American lines. The next night, the 505th Pier followed, executing an equally flawless drop. The sudden arrival of over 3,000 elite infantrymen stunned the Germans and stabilized the front. The Salerno beachhead was saved. This success, a second turning point, completely reversed the airborne's fortunes. It demonstrated the doctrine's true potential as a rapid, flexible strategic reserve that could be deployed anywhere on the battlefield with decisive effect. Confidence was restored, both within the division and, more importantly, within the Allied High Command. The Germans also took note. The sloppy amateurs of Sicily had become the swift saviors of Salerno. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now tasked with defending Fortress Europe from the expected Allied invasion, began to see the airborne threat in a new light. His reports to Berlin increasingly warned of the danger, and on his inspection tour of the French coast, he ordered the placement of new defenses not just on the beaches, but also in the fields and pastures inland, the likely drop zones for this newly proven American weapon. The success at Salerno ensured the airborne divisions would play a central role in the upcoming invasion of France, Operation Overlord, but the debate over their use was far from over. As the 82nd and the newly arrived 101st Airborne Divisions trained relentlessly in England through the spring of 1944, a powerful counter-argument emerged from a key figure. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Forces, became convinced that the planned Normandy drop was a suicide mission. He pointed to the massive increase in German anti-aircraft batteries in the landing zones, the specialized anti-airborne infantry divisions like the 91st Air Landing Division that were now stationed in the Cotentin Peninsula, and the networks of sharpened poles, dubbed Rommel's asparagus, that Rommel had ordered planted in every open field. Leigh-Mallory formerly predicted that the airborne assault would suffer catastrophic losses, estimating that 70% of the glider troops and 50% of the paratroopers would be killed or wounded before they could become an effective fighting force. On May 29, 1944, just a week before the planned invasion, he went to Eisenhower and begged him to call it off. Eisenhower was faced with a terrible choice. The logic was sound, the risks were immense, but the strategic imperative was greater. The amphibious landings, particularly at Utah Beach, depended on the airborne seizing the causeways leading inland from the deliberately flooded coastal plains. Without those causeways, the American 4th Infantry Division would be trapped on the narrow beach and annihilated. Eisenhower listened to Leigh-Mallory's dire warnings, then turned to his subordinate and said, "I am prepared to take the responsibility." The drop would go on, but it would not be a repeat of Sicily. The lessons had been learned. An entirely new suite of technology and tactics was in place. Pathfinders now carried Eureka Rebecca radar transponder beacons, which sent out a signal that the lead C-47s could home in on, guiding them directly to the drop zone. Pilots had undergone hundreds of hours of additional training in night formation flying. The logistical effort was staggering. Over 1,600 transport aircraft and gliders were marshaled. More than 24,000 British and American airborne troops were sealed in their camps, studying sand table models of their objectives and receiving their final mission briefings. The American paratroopers were laden with more equipment than ever before, from personal weapons to demolition charges, extra ammunition, and medical supplies, all meticulously packed. For the 101st Airborne, a small, cheap toy was added to the issue list, a child's cricket-shaped clicker. In the confusion of a night battle, one click was to be answered by two. It was a simple, analog solution to the deadly problem of identifying friend from foe in the dark. The night of June 5, 1944, was a maelstrom of controlled power. From airfields across southern England, the engines of 821 C-47 Skytrains coughed to life, their sound building into a deafening roar that shook the ground. Inside, over 13,000 American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. They were heading for 6 drop zones scattered across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, behind a stretch of sand codenamed Utah Beach. Their mission was to sow chaos, seize bridges and crossroads, and most critically, secure the 4 causeways leading inland from the beach. As the massive aerial armada crossed the English Channel, it entered a thick bank of clouds and ran into streams of German flak. Formations began to break apart. The precision of Salerno gave way to the reality of combat. The green lights flashed on. Men shuffled to the doors, hooked their static lines to the anchor cable, and plunged into the darkness of Normandy. The jump was a study in chaos. As in Sicily, the drop was wildly scattered. Some sticks of paratroopers landed perfectly on their designated drop zones. Others landed miles away. Men from the 101st found themselves in the 82nd operational area and vice versa. Paratroopers from the 506th Pier were scattered over an area of 25 by 15 miles. Many landed in the fields Rommel had deliberately flooded, and weighed down by their heavy equipment, they drowned in the shallow water before they could free themselves from their parachute harnesses. But this time, something was different. The men were not rookies. They were combat veterans of Sicily and Italy, or had been trained to the highest possible standard. Instead of panicking, they adapted. Alone or in small groups, they cut down German communication lines, ambushed patrols, and began moving toward their objectives. The cricket clickers of the 101st began to sound in the night, a metallic snap answered by 2 more, as scattered soldiers slowly coalesced into small, lethal fighting units. In a stroke of luck, a small group of paratroopers from the 508th Pier ambushed a staff car carrying General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the German 91st Air Landing Division. Falle was killed instantly, decapitating the command structure of the very unit best prepared to counter the invasion. For the crucial first hours, the German response was paralyzed. Meanwhile, in the town of St. Mir-Église, a key crossroads, men from the 505th Pier under Lieutenant Colonel Edward Croix landed directly in and around the town square, fighting a fierce, close-quarters battle to secure what would become the first French town liberated by American forces in the invasion. The airborne assault was not going according to plan, but it was succeeding through the initiative and sheer bloody-mindedness of the individual trooper on the ground. By dawn on June 6th, the situation in the American airborne sector was a confused but undeniable success. The German command was in disarray, receiving frantic reports of paratroopers landing everywhere from Cherbourg to Caentan. The very scatter that had been a symptom of failure in Sicily had, in Normandy, become an unintentional masterstroke of deception. It convinced the Germans that a massive, division-sized force had landed in multiple locations, preventing them from concentrating their reserves against any single point. This confusion bought precious time. While the Germans struggled to understand the scale of the attack, small groups of paratroopers achieved their primary goals. Elements of the 101st, despite heavy casualties and being hopelessly mixed, fought their way to the causeways leading from Utah Beach. They seized control of the northern exits, ensuring that when the 4th Infantry Division came ashore a few hours later, their path inland was open. The landings at Utah were a stunning success, with only 197 casualties on D-Day, a fraction of the bloodbath occurring simultaneously at Omaha Beach. That success was owed directly to the paratroopers who had jumped into the darkness behind it. The price, however, was high. In the first 24 hours of combat, the 101st Airborne suffered 1,240 casualties. The 82nd Airborne lost 1,259 men, thousands more injured in the jump itself, their bodies battered by the violent exit from the aircraft and the hard landing, yet they had achieved their strategic objectives. St. Mir-Église was in American hands. The Utah Beach flank was secure. The German counterattack was fatally disrupted before it could even begin. When Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st, finally located his divisional headquarters, he found it consisted of a handful of officers and men. It was a far cry from the powerful division that had left England, but it was enough. The German High Command, which had once dismissed the American Airborne as an amateurish failure, now faced a new reality. The paratroopers were not just a nuisance, they were a dagger that had been plunged into the heart of their defenses. The laughter had stopped. The experiment that had nearly died in the skies over Sicily had become one of the most feared and effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. The Normandy drop was not a textbook victory of precise execution. It was a testament to resilience. It proved that a military doctrine's success is not measured by its flawless application, but by its ability to function and achieve its goals amidst the chaos and friction of real combat. The American paratrooper, weighed down with equipment and dropped, often alone, into the dark heart of Fortress Europe, had demonstrated a capacity for individual initiative and small unit leadership that far surpassed the rigid, top-down command structure of his opponents. The ultimate victory in Normandy was not simply one of technology, the Pathfinder beacons, the thousands of aircraft, but of human factors. It was a victory of training that pushed men to their limits, of a command that learned from its catastrophic mistakes, and of a soldier who, when all plans failed, knew how to pick himself up, find a friend in the darkness, and start walking toward the sound of the guns. The material reality of what the United States could deploy, the sheer industrial might that could field over 13,000 airborne troops in a single night and absorb the terrible cost, had overwhelmed a German defense that was prepared for a conventional assault, but was psychologically and tactically unraveled by this vertical envelopment. The myth of the perfect, pinpoint airborne assault was dead. In its place stood the far more powerful reality of a weapon that worked precisely because it was messy, chaotic, and impossible to predict.